All right, dev mode. For those who don't know, dev mode is a new space in Figma for developers to efficiently take ideas from design into production. Um, right now, dev mode, and for the rest of this year, dev mode is free to all users on all plans, just totally available for you to check out. At the beginning of 2024, on January 1st, it's going to be packaged with the Figma editor license. So anyone who has a Figma editor license will have access to dev mode. If you don't want a Figma editor license and you are in an org, we'll have a separate way to get dev mode, and it'll be a dev mode only license. That'll be $25 per month per org, $35 on enterprise. Viewers, people who don't have access, will still be able to copy values, generate code, export assets, and collaborate with designers the same way they do today in design mode. If you want to have a sense of like what that experience is going to look like, we get to that and we demonstrate that in the last office hours as well. So more info there. If you want to learn more about dev mode, Help Center, it's a great place to start. We did a deep dive at Config. Me and 3 other folks were on stage talking about it at Config. And we also have an awesome playground file. Oh, the Config video is online. That's why we're talking about it. It's on YouTube. And then you can also duplicate the playground file. There is also, I made a Fig Jam. I think it's a pretty cool Fig Jam. If we could get someone to dump it in the chat. It's called the Figma Developer Resources Fig Jam. It's currently not published to the community. It needs to be. I'll get to that. But there's a ton of different videos on here, links to the APIs, documentation, links to the Discord community. So feel free to check that out. Lots of resources in here. Brilliant. Let's get started. So we're here to talk about designer-developer collaboration. And as an engineer, I have a background, building component libraries, working alongside design systems designers to kind of like build out component libraries to be utilized. And I think when we go to think about collaboration between designers and developers, we need to kind of start at a bit higher level and talk about product development and what collaboration looks like in product development. And this is when we talk to customers and we talk to people that are using Figma today. It kind of breaks down into 4 pillars. And we'll get into the specifics here of who is in these pillars in a second, but let's talk about this at a high level. So at the core kind of design systems level, we have patterns, and we have patterns in design and we have patterns in code. Sometimes this is like design library, like design systems, component libraries and stuff, but sometimes this is like, especially like early on for a product, this can be like class naming conventions, color tokens, visual accessibility patterns. You're thinking about from a design perspective, the different patterns that are manifest in your product. Similarly, on the code side, you're thinking about maybe a component library structure, but you can also be thinking about like style conventions, file structure, interactivity patterns, semantic accessibility concerns, and how you're thinking about your UI from that code pattern perspective. Then above that, we have the product side of it. So you have designers that are creating product screens, right? And bringing those patterns into life in terms of like putting them in a design, mocking up flows, that sort of a thing. You also, on the other side, have product engineering. And these are the engineers that are hooking this stuff up. They're connecting to the back end, right? Because there's a whole bunch of back end code too. And they're implementing that design. So when we think about these 4 pillars, let's think about who is in them, right? So on this left side, we clearly have design. On the right side, we clearly have engineering. And then on the top, we have product. And on the bottom, we have patterns, right? And you can use all different words to describe this. And like for a lot of folks, like sometimes this is one person doing all 4 things. Sometimes this is one person doing each of those things. Sometimes this is entire teams doing each of these things, multiple teams doing some of these things. But overall, there's these 4 kind of categories of roles. So you have product and feature designers up here kind of doing the product design. You have UI or design systems designers doing the design patterns. You have UI, design systems, front-end engineers kind of building out these code patterns. And then on the in the product engineering side, this is implementing the design. You have full stack engineers doing it, front end engineers doing it. Sometimes back end engineers are getting pulled in to implement these designs and connect the front end to the back end. Sometimes it's like an entry level developer is like, I just got hired. I'm trying to get used to the code base. Oftentimes, this is a role they find themselves in too. So this is kind of who's doing this stuff. So when we talk about collaboration, I like to think of it as there's two axes. You have a horizontal axis and a vertical axis. On this vertical axis, right? So between design patterns and product design, you have the ergonomics of what's being created, like the designer experience with what's being created coming down, right? So the product designer is like, hey, these components or these patterns, like we need to grow them a little bit to account for new things we're trying to do, or it's really difficult to use these components. Can you change kind of like the language of what they are? Because I know I get confused. I don't know what variant to use, right? So the ergonomics of these patterns, are they serving the brand? Are they serving the direction of the product? Are they easy to use for the product designers that are using them? That's going in that energy is going down, right, to the design patterns designers, right? And what the design patterns folks are doing is they're trying to drive adoption, right? They're trying to get coverage. We want to build patterns that reflect everything and are consistent in our product. And in order to do that, like we need to drive adoption, right? Same thing, exact same conversation is happening on the code side. We have code patterns being created by UI engineers or design systems engineers. They're building out components. They're building out like frameworks for how to think about the UI, and they're also like creating things that are going to be implemented and used by these product engineers that are implementing these things. And sometimes those folks don't know anything about the front end. Sometimes they know a lot about the front end. Sometimes they know a lot but don't want to write any front end code, right? Sometimes they really want to write front end code. So these patterns that are happening in this bottom right quadrant here, we're wanting to make sure that those are ergonomic, easy to use. You're baking accessibility into like the components that you're creating. All of those sorts of concerns are kind of happening at that pattern level. And then the product engineer is like, hey, developer experience wise, this is really confusing. I don't understand how to implement any of this. Like I need better documentation or I need better components. So that's, again, that ergonomics energy going in that downward direction. So that's what collaboration looks like vertically. But then we also have horizontal collaboration, right? So we have at this bottom level, we have our design patterns and our code patterns. We're having this kind of back and forth about, a design systems designer being like, here's the intent of our design system. Here's what we're trying to build here. This is what reflects the brand. This is what reflects what our product designers are thinking about. And coming back in this other direction, we have kind of this like real world's like not the best word for it. There's a bunch of words you can use. You could use constraints, implications, feasibility, requirements, but you have this like, okay, this is great. I'm down. Here's what that's going to take from an effort perspective. If you make these concessions, maybe this will be easier to implement, but it won't be exactly what you're asking for, right? So you kind of have this back and forth and you're trying to align on what is this system we're building together that's both practical and covering like what we're trying to do at a design systems component library level. Then on the top, you have a very similar conversation happening where these product designers are like, hey, here's the new checkout flow. Here's the new whatever. And it's using this design system. And the product engineers are looking at it and being like, okay, cool. But like for some technical reason, this might be more difficult than you might think, or what about this scenario that you might not have designed for? What are we going to do here, right? So then there's this kind of real world implication coming back in the other direction. And this horizontal collaboration is best seen not as a series of concessions, but rather as we're trying to arrive at the best thing we can do together, right? And a huge part of that is our intent, and a huge part of that is practical, real world, what can we build? And so you're trying to get to that perfect merging of both of those things at both of these levels horizontally. So that's a little bit of kind of like theory and modeling for kind of how we can think about these roles. So let's get into actually looking at what this looks like inside of Figma. So we're going to do a demo here, and Louis is going to kind of be this blue persona. and I'm going to be this green persona. And we're going to kind of talk about a component library that we've been collaborating on for this live stream. So Louis, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you.
Oh,
We
that's
already
so
have
good.
we already have a great question from the audience where we can start. And that is, where do we see the difference between atoms and patterns in a design system? And firstly, the design and the code implementation could and probably will be very different. If
Yeah.
we can even just look at the input field in this file, we
Yeah,
know
let's go.
that
Where is it?
on the right-hand side,
Beautiful.
we know that technically we've got an atom because you're going to build an atomic version of this when you're coding up. In Figma, though, we've probably got loads of different elements in here.
Mm-hmm.
So technically, we've got loads of atoms being thrown into a single atom. And to me, that structurally doesn't make sense, which is where the atom definition starts to become, will fall apart a little bit. If you were to then go and build this and you're looking around and trying to figure out terminology and definitions, we might immediately find our first roadblock.
Yeah. Yeah, you want me to flop over to dev mode here and we'll take a peek at some of this definition? Yeah, so here, let me pull out an instance. I'm back over to dev mode. Is this what you were wanting to look at? I can also follow you if that's easier.
Yeah, we're where we are. Yeah. If we look at this example, let's say, okay, I'm throwing this component to you. How are you going to build it for the web?
Yeah, so we have a basic text input here. And I know that like you also have like this possibility of icons, right? Exactly. Inside of it. That's one thing that's like kind of not apparent. And when you're kind of just looking at it visually, but is it just a start icon? Oh no, it's both. So we have
an icon at the start or the end.
Let's do this right now. Let's turn them on. I don't know. We'll do like a play icon, a very realistic input here.
It looks great.
And then we'll switch. Yeah, we'll switch this one to a plus, right? So we have these two icons, right? So from inputs are really hairy. So from a Figma perspective, you're thinking of this as an auto layout with two icons, like on either side of a text node, right? And then you have like, if we inspect in here, we can probably get, there's a gap. Here we go. So this is one feature of dev mode here is that we have the variables being used, highlighted over these gaps. So we could see that there's like this padding default token between the icon and the text inside of this input. But this is not even like if we were building for the web, this is one of the few cases where we'd actually be preferring absolute position of this icon. And we'd be creating a padding on that left-hand side of the text input to create the visual space for this icon to be absolutely positioned. Because in our world, it's not a rectangle with a bunch of stuff inside. It's actually an input, which is a totally self-contained rectangle. And then you overlay stuff on top of it as a form element.
And so that's just one.
That's one. Yeah, that's one.
One example of the text field. Yeah. And we've got all these questions immediately. Let's now say that in my design, I'm using this text field as a password field.
Yeah.
That's a different type.
Do you have it as a variant at all or no?
No, we don't. And that's something that needs to be decided by the designers and the developers about whether you create, I could go in this file and create 5 different components for inputs for the different types that we want to support: password, email, number, whatever.
Yes.
Or I could just have one component for text, change the content, change the appearance to seem like these other components, and just either make you figure it out or document it.
Yep. So like specifically, for example, if we're building for the web, the input element in HTML has a type attribute. And that type, the word type, is a part of the HTML spec. So we use the word type in HTML to refer to the type of input. It could be text, number, password, There's a ton more. Checkbox is actually an input type. So is radio. So the HTML element itself called input is kind of like, we almost need to separate it as an entity from the component that you're describing. And we would say that we would use that HTML element to represent this component, but we'd also use that HTML element to represent other components. And something like a type is actually like really only going to appear in code for the text, password, number, email delineation, right? That's really only something that's going to happen in code. Like a designer might want to be like, here's what it would look like to have a password that's just a bunch of dots, maybe. Yeah. But like, that's more kind of potentially like a prototyping thing, like to spoof something more than it would be like a design direction, right?
But again, where we got deviation here is that the designer would maybe need a different font for the hashed password than the value of the input field. That indicates either new component, new style, maybe both. If you just zoom out, or if you just zoom out in this section here and see how many
I'm following
you. We've got a handful of different input types here inside the input section.
Yeah.
These, when you're building it, probably just one component, maybe a couple. When you're changing the type and flipping that out and then changing the style using the CSS to do that. But we're building this in a way more flat way in the design side to make it easier to find, update, publish, maintain, consume all these components for designers. If you flip over to the assets panel now, sorry, the assets panel next to the layers. And see the inputs section that we have in here.
This is what your product designer counterparts are looking at when they're trying to build out a design, right?
Yes. And the structure of the organization of the components in the file impacts this. So we've got three personas that need to figure out how to build, maintain, and consume these components.
Yes.
And we have this temptation to drop people into these experiences without thinking, how is this going to be searched for? How is this going to be used or like modified on the canvas? The properties, the variants, all that sort of stuff. And then that translation layer that you need when you're building it, we start to fall down or trip up on naming conventions. So we had this long discussion about the word type and the word variant in here.
Right.
And if we jump over to the button example again, and you take a look at the way that we've structured that variant, this is another thing of what's an atom? How does that get translated? What's the naming convention we're going to use to align something or deviate something? And maybe that's an opportunity to maybe jump over and take a look at the component inspector to see how we're going to translate this.
Yeah, absolutely. So I built a plugin that runs in dev mode called the component inspector that kind of helps you as a developer just understand what the properties are like in code terms. So one thing that we should look at here before we hop over is let's look at them over in design mode. So you've got a variant here. And within that, you've got inverse, positive, primary, and secondary. It's a variant call variant, which is one of those things that we talked about. We also have this state, which is asterisk prefixed, which is a very difficult word to say. And the state refers to this default, hover, active, disabled focus. You also have a text property, which is a label. So this allows us, when we bring out an instance, it allows us to customize what that text is inside of the button. We have icon start, we have icon end, and we'll notice that this is like designer ergonomically created, right, Louis? You do this little thing where you have, let me pull out an instance. That's the entire component. Tell me you're a developer using design mode without telling me you're a developer using design mode. This is why dev mode is great. Okay, so we have this instance here, right? Notice how icon start and icon end are Boolean switches, right? So when we flip that switch, this is how you do it in Figma. Like, this is the Figma way to do it. If you're a developer on this call right now, you might be like, that makes no sense. I don't think about things that way. But this is how these things are configured in Figma, because from a designer ergonomic perspective, it's the best way to model it. So we have a Boolean property called icon start. Then Louis creates an icon start instance swap property, which allows us to swap in icons, right? So we're kind of looking at this with the input. We'll do the filled one here. So you have this like dependency of two separate properties, and this little text arrow right here looks like it's a piece of UI. It's actually Louis' naming convention for the property itself. So Louis named it this way so it looks related, right? And this is something that, like, when Louis is building out a design system that is going to be implemented by designers, it's very important to make it so that it makes a lot of sense to increase the adoption of the design system at that product design level. As a component library developer, UI engineer, I'm thinking about these properties in terms of what they're going to mean to the person who's implementing these components in the code base. So when we shift over here to dev mode, Shift D, by the way, if you use keyboard shortcuts, this is my plugin that we're talking about called the Component Inspector. And what it does is it generates code for components that shows their properties in the inspect panel in CodeGen mode. So we can do Angular, we can do React, we can do Vue. There's two separate APIs for Vue. You can do either one. It also does web components and spits out JSON, but that's not as important. We're going to stick to React for just a second here. And we will, I'm not going to regenerate code here. I'm just going to deselect and then reselect. Okay, cool. So we'll see that, like, first of all, a bunch of these properties have been removed from the code output for this instance of a button. There's no icon start Boolean property. Louis' little arrow thing doesn't exist, but we can see that it's pulling in the icon play filled, and it's saying that the variant is secondary here. So if we look, we're also ignoring that state, that default, hover, active, disabled, and focused. That's because in code, that's not a property. When I implement this button in code, I don't say implement a hovered button. I say implement a button, and then behind the scenes, because I'm a UI engineer that loves to write CSS or whatever, I've made it so that the hover state will match, right? These interactive things will just match when it's implemented. So when Akbar's coming in to look at this button to implement it, he doesn't need to know, like, it's in the default state. He just needs to know what this code is right here, which is just, what variant is it? Maybe you have sizes, maybe you have, other variants. What icon is being used? And we'll notice that the label, the text label, has been brought in as children, right? Which is how React would do it. React would say, hey, when you have content for something, it's typically seen as the children, which is this right here, button label. Now,
that also converts it back into the atom.
Yes. If you want to think about
that, single element.
Yeah. Yes. So from a design systems perspective, I would be building this component out. So we were just talking about the instance code, and we're going to get more into the instance stuff in a second when we're talking about how a developer would use dev mode to implement this stuff, like in their code base, in a feature or whatever. As a design systems engineer, the code that I'm writing looks much more like this. And this is like, for those who aren't engineers, this is kind of like the component definition in code, right? So you have kind of your big, component sets that you build in design mode to kind of reflect all the possibilities of the button. That's what this is on the code side. We build out these definitions that say, here are all the properties, here are all the parameters. This is where we would bring in the style. We would say, this variant looks this way, this variant looks this way, the size is this big, uses these tokens, whatever. All of that would get mapped inside of this. But you'll notice that, like, this code actually doesn't really do much more than show the properties. it's not trying to style the button. It's just trying to convey to someone like me what these properties are, because I probably have a bunch of opinions about how to actually style this, build it semantically or whatever. So I'm looking at this and being like, oh, okay. So there's this variant called variant. It has these 4 options, right? And then here's roughly what that would look like in a props interface. Now, we'll see when we get to what Akbar has been working on. We'll see that in the code base, there's a whole lot more properties than just these. And so this code would have a lot added to it later on with a bunch of code exclusive properties. But it gives us kind of like a rough approximation of what's happening in Figma in code terms, right? And it allows me as a developer who may not be super design inclined, like, or design systems inclined, to kind of just like make these little translations. It has a lot of things like, oh, it's made everything lowercase, you know, because that's typically what you would use for a variant. It's not requiring that Louis goes ahead and makes all of that lowercase, right? Because from a designer ergonomics thing, and this, Louis, you can speak up, this is something subjective that, like, as a team, we could make a decision about.
Yeah, this is also something that we spoke about when making this file of what casing do you prefer for my top level component name, the props that are used, the variants that are used, the variables that are used. And your answer was, I don't know, let's make this agnostic. We can think about the translation of that at the code stage. And then that allows the design team to think about what they would prefer for the naming conventions in Figma. Personally, that is uppercase, but there's nothing preventing me from going like all lowercase at some point if that's what the team would prefer. It's a discussion that you can design to dev and in design and in dev.
Yeah, I mean, if we were just a bunch of hybrid designer developers, we might prefer to just have it all be unified because it wouldn't be confusing to any of us, right? Like the conventions like this, I think this is a really important thing to understand when we're talking about designer developer collaboration, is how relative it is to the teams that are working together, right? And how relative it is to the experience and you can learn things. You can also embrace differences, and neither of those things are bad. It's just a matter of what's best for the situation you're currently in. One thing I'll add here is that we've linked on this button main component, we've added a dev resource. Now, that means any instance of this button, this little dev resource right here to a GitHub file is going to show up. So when I click on this, we're actually, through GitHub, pulling up, albeit a reduced sample piece of code, the component file, right? From our code base for this component. If we want to create that link, we can. So you can create dev resources all over dev mode for whatever you want. You can use something like the GitHub integration to have it open up inside. So there's a GitHub plugin that allows you to do this. But you could also link to Storybook, link to your own custom rolled up thing or whatever, and have links on these components so that when they're implemented, people can jump to examples, they can jump to the definitions and whatnot. So I think this would be a good place to kind of like come back here, right? So we've been talking a lot about how these two personas are collaborating together in Figma using dev mode to kind of go back and like, I'm in dev mode, Louis is in design mode. We're talking about these things together, right? Looking at the things that are, you know, looking at it through the developer lens of dev mode, looking at it through the designer lens of design mode. And we're thinking about how we influence the people above us and how we serve the people above us, right? How we're serving these engineers that are implementing the components, how we're serving these designers that are implementing this design, how that's ultimately serving the product. And we're thinking about that as we're making these decisions together, right? That type of collaboration is key in order for any of this stuff to get adopted, in order for there's a certain amount of trust that's involved here to really make collaboration work as a team. So we're going to switch to this part now, right? So we're going to talk, Akbar is going to kind of be this product engineer in red, and we're going to kind of talk about maybe some of the product design stuff too in purple. But ultimately, we're going to look here at like how dev mode serves kind of this red use case, right? And how Arpar is going to consume these components that Louis and I have worked on together. So Arpar, I don't know, probably if you want to take over screen share.
Yep, I'll go ahead and do that.
And now I can catch up on chat.
Yeah, here's a great example of how one way that dev mode is here for somebody who's a production engineer, wants to get in and out of Figma as fast as possible, trying to understand what's changed, what's happening. This is a great place where, for instance, Louis, who's acting as my product designer, might have shared this link, shared the copy dev link, and now they can share this to me directly, and I have exactly where I need to be to look at the changes that I need to make. And for those of you that aren't aware, I'm going to go over just a few things in dev mode that make this a little bit easier for me to navigate. So I'm assuming I'm not as familiar with Figma. I'm here just to take a look at what's changed in the design. You can see that the layout in this Figma file is a lot simpler for me than it was for Louis, where all of the pages are being shown by default. I can see screens is ready for development with that badge. All the other pages are hidden by default, but if I wanted to see them, I could go ahead and look at them. But what's also really cool is I have these thumbnails for each of those frames that are ready. And so if I click on this thumbnail, it automatically navigates there. I can go anywhere in the file, click back on it. It'll jump me back right there. And I can inspect each of the layers in this file. And if I hover over anything, I can see the different red lines and margins and gaps. And one thing you might notice is that they're being represented by spacing tokens that Louis had explicitly set up when building these designs. And one thing that's really nice about this is these are the same tokens that I'm going to be using in code. So the language that we're using is aligned. So when I go into code and I'm thinking about like the types of spacing that's needed, that's exactly what it's going to match up to. And I can make that consistent across different platforms. So the other thing that's pretty helpful here is that I can see which components are being used. So for instance, I'm going to go around and navigate here on the inspect panel. It looks like for the dialog, we have this Jira task that the dialog component isn't created yet. And this immediately kind of tells me that if my task was to make sure that the changes on the screen are implemented, I know that we're using our design system, and I know that I'm noticing that this dialog isn't in a component and the component doesn't exist. If I open this ticket, I see that Jake was working on this. It's a high priority thing. I can reach out to Jake. He can tell me that it's only going to take a couple of days. And so I can go back to my product designer, let them know that this thing is currently blocked by this task, or it's more urgent and I need to go ahead and start building this already. Then I can use the inspect panel to start making a one-time component and then go ahead and just build that out in HTML and CSS. And so the things that are helpful for me here, again, understanding those tokens, understanding the layout in terms of what I need to build. There are these component tokens. I can see what their properties are. One neat thing to do is if your team has some time, I invest a little bit more into dev mode and has created their own custom code gen plugin, you can customize the output of this based on your team. Since we're using these components that were kind of built with Jake and Louis involved, we're using the component inspector plugin, and I can see that interface, that component definition that Jake was talking about before and where that would come in, as well as how, in this instance, I would use this code generation to go ahead and get started. And what this is doing is it allows me to start from a place where I know which components are being used. I know which components already exist because I can see them in my dev resources. I can go ahead and start implementing a page with these to get 90% of the way for which components are being used. And I can focus on the logic in the backend to tie this to the data that needs to happen, the data that it needs to represent, actions that it needs to take. And that's a pretty quick overview of just kind of all the different things that you see in dev mode. Another thing to highlight here is like selection colors for if I need to manually implement something, I can see them right here. And if I click on this, look at the different values. And when clicking on this, just clicking those to the clipboard, make that really easy to jump back and forth.
This is so great. And I want to make sure that, like, you mentioned it, you sat on it for a second, but I want to like reiterate, you happened upon like a Jira ticket inside of your like browsing of this feature file, right? And this is something that's like actively eliminating excess conversations, right? When you bring kind of like the product development status, especially at the design systems level, because like so often it's like we're trying to evolve this product design and component libraries are trying to catch up. Design systems is like trying its best to catch up. And sometimes you're putting stuff out into the world that hasn't fully been captured with the design system yet. Sometimes that's a very practical thing that happens, and it's okay because you're testing out whether or not new things are needed. But by bringing in your task management into this workflow, you're eliminating extra conversations that would need to happen, extra syncs of like, oh, Arbor went and just implemented this, not realizing that I'm working on a component for it and that the component's coming out next week. And like, you're like, this is actively injecting like helpers along the way to kind of like allow us to be more in sync, async, right? And I just invented that, but I feel like that actually is a great term for it, right? Where we're able to kind of like collaborate more effectively without having to schedule a conversation, hop in a huddle, whatever it is.
Yeah.
One other thing that I wanted to show, we didn't show, I'm working on a variables plugin that I think could be an interesting example of code gen. It's currently not published, but I think it could be something to quickly show as another type of thing that fits in this dev mode context. So I'm going to share the right screen. So this is a plugin I have that's currently in development. It's called Figma Token JSON. We've been thinking a lot about like how to manifest like variables. Is my screen clear for everybody? Cool. How to manifest tokens for Figma variables, like in JSON format, because there's a spec out there for what tokens should look like in JSON. Then there's Figma variables that do a whole bunch of things. But one of the things they do frequently, especially with colors, is translate to design tokens in a JSON file. And so I've been doing a lot of thinking about how to think about this in terms of JSON. So that's what this plugin is for those who are interested. Let's quickly select like this button here, right? So this primary button, no, you know what? Let's do the dialog because it's not a component. And we can see here, let me make sure I'm selecting the right thing. Yeah, the BG default, hold on, it doesn't, which element in here, Louis, has the actual fill? That's the real question.
All of it.
All of
if you
it?
select the...
Here we go. We'll do the text color for a second. So as we can see here, if we look at the color, right? The color of this text is text body. Now, we have a fairly sophisticated, not fairly sophisticated. We have like a baseline of sophistication of our variables library where we have, I'm going to switch out of design mode or out of dev mode. I'm going to show it right here. So we have a semantic color library, which has two modes, a day and a night mode. And we have within that, right, these are mapped to other variables, right? And that's our primitives collection. So if we come over here to primitive color, here's our primitive palette, right? It's a single mode. It's our color swatches, our entire palette. So when we come back in here and we select this text, we can see that it's the text body, right? Which is often what you need to implement it. But sometimes the context that's missing is like, what about all the other stuff, right? What is this map to? And you can access that with the plugin API. So we can see that this is the semantic, collection, and then it's the color group, and it's the text body, or it's the semantic color collection, and then the text body token. And it's a color, and then there's two modes. Each of those modes are mapped to, they're aliased to a primitive token, right? So we see that connection right inside of here. So this is an example of something that like you could build a plugin for, maybe a CodeGen plugin. You could also have a plugin like this run in the inspect panel full screen with the UI or full panel with the UI if you wanted to make it visual instead of code-based. But this is me letting you know that this stuff is, I made this plugin in about 30 minutes yesterday, and you have access to all of these things. And this could be a private org plugin. This could be something you publish to the community. The access is there if you're looking for this sort of information with the plugin API. One other thing that some folks might find useful, the same plugin generates kind of W3C spec JSON-ish JSON for all the variables that are local in the file. So I'm going to have something like this published soon, but I'm showing this more to let you know that the tools are there if you're very interested in building things like this. I don't know, Louis, if you have anything to speak to about variables, but I'm excited about what you can do with the APIs for this sort of a thing.
Yeah, I think there's similar to what we were talking about before with naming conventions, is that I have added a bunch of emojis to names of these variables, and that doesn't really matter for you because you can do what you need to.
Yeah, that's really where extensibility can like absolutely help out, right? So you put like the palette emoji, right, in these names, you put semicolons or colons, you're decorating these things so that your designers ergonomically find this stuff easy to use. There's nothing wrong with that, right? There's a world that says, just use all the same language, but extensibility allows us to be like, no, we care about the words. We can filter out all the other stuff, we can handle that. So I used a plugin to generate, this syntax using your unique terminology, but that translation is where there's subjectivity. And so it's hard to do something that applies for everybody. It's hard to do something that translates for everybody because the design convention is relative to the designers and the code convention is relative to the developers. So it can be hard to build something that everyone can use all the time, which is kind of what I'm attempting to do with the component inspector. But this does a similar thing, I guess, that this one of the conventions that Louis and I are following is this asterisk in front of a property name, which we alluded to earlier. Basically, we decided that an asterisk means something that doesn't render as a property in code. So we were saying how hover, focus aren't necessarily properties in code. So Louis puts an asterisk in front of it, and my component inspector, we can see, is ignoring it. And the reason for that is because the component inspector has a setting that allows you to specify a prefix to ignore. And so we just said, hey, internally, that's going to be an asterisk. So we'll set that for the plugin. And now that anything with an asterisk in front of it, if I, as a developer, say, our developers don't need to know about that, we could put an asterisk in front of it and it'll be ignored. That could be an emoji if we want it to be an emoji.
There's a couple of questions popping up around
Let's do it.
The translation across platforms. And there's a few ways you could approach it, either like variable translation or visual component translation to different platforms. And we were looking at the select element earlier, right? And how
my goodness,
there are differences in web, iOS native, Android native. That would impact how you build your Figma file, but also how you're building it in code massively, because designers could build these real big custom things like we're looking at right now. This is technically the select, but it's also really not. It's like a multi-select that you might want to build, which has a beautiful implementation on iOS. The web implementation is not so great. So there's somewhere in the middle where we need to decide how custom we want to go and how much work we want to put into this build.
Yeah. So the implementation Louis is talking about is iOS web. So like Safari. If you have a select element in HTML with the multiple attribute set to true, which means you can select multiple, it has a really awesome, like you can create groups, you can collapse groups in HTML, all of that. Just semantic HTML translates to a beautiful experience on mobile. On desktop, it's this big box and you have to like command shift everything, which, command shift click or whatever it is to select everything. And that's like, I don't know, not ideal on like a desktop browser, right? And I don't even know what it looks like on Android. But these are the sorts of things that we would have to be considering, right? Or if we had an iOS app, that wasn't a web view, and maybe we had an Android app. There are implications of these sorts of things. A benefit of the web, why I'm like diehard web guy, is that it's just magical when it works, and it can be very accessible without you having to do anything, right? It just works. Tabbing works, spacebar works, enter works. You don't have to like do anything. You don't have to write any code. You don't have to use running arrow key mouse events or do any of that. Now, for some folks, they might be using another library, another JavaScript framework that's done all of this, right? That's fine too, right? But when you decide to build one of these things from scratch, there can be many implications at the implementation level that you need to consider, just in terms of timeline. Sometimes you don't have developers that can do it particularly well. Like that's often a case. I haven't always been able to program everything, right? And so, there's also a case to be made about like, are we able to build something that is truly accessible are we capable of building that, is often a question as well for a lot of different things. So, multiple select, that's something. I also, on iOS, I prefer the standard select experience too, where you tap on it and the thing comes up and then you scroll up and down to find the thing. To me, that native experience, since it's native, it's really performant. You can still style what the select looks like, but that open, the popover part, I prefer the iOS, like every time. I prefer the native iOS selection experience.
And then if we start thinking about how variables get translated into different platforms, you start dancing in the wind of like style dictionary and that kind of thing.
Yes. And ultimately, it's kind of, you need to choose the tool that's right for your need, right? Like, you need to really understand your environment. How many platforms are we building for? Are we mobile only? Like, that's a thing, you really need to understand the variables, not the Figma variables, but the variables that are in play to help influence a decision about, should we use style dictionary? Should we come up with our own JSON schema? Chances are that's probably not going to be what you do for too much longer. Like, we're going to get there soon. Once we officially have like a great way to model modes in the spec. That's, I think, one of the biggest hangups. Okay, cool. Just to be cognizant of time, we got about 7 minutes left. I do want to make sure, if there's things we haven't gotten to, we've got a whole nother one of these coming up. So like, we want to speak to what you want to hear about, what would unblock you. We could talk about this all day. We could probably do like 7 more of these office hours. I would love to do that. So if we don't get to anything today that you really need to hear about, we see you. We still have the Q&A record, and we're going to be doing more of this. Is there anything else that we really want to cover before we keep moving forward? Louis, what else is on your mind?
Yeah, we've made some decisions in this file based off a compromise on naming conventions, whereas some teams don't necessarily have the luxury of even talking to designers or developers.
Yes.
It would probably be useful for us to just talk through a scenario where maybe you're using outsourced dev team, or maybe you're using outsourced design team. How do you influence each other in a way that is beneficial to everybody from a convention view?
Yes, that's classic. That's a classic case. I've been on teams where, let's actually look at this. I've been on teams where the red is outsourced. The green was my team and we were outsourced. And then the blue and purple was internal, right? Like, I've been in that scenario, right? 2 separate outsourced engineering teams, one for the front end design system stuff, one for the implementation and back end and all of that. Oh boy, is this an interesting one. I feel like I don't want to say it depends. It depends is the biggest comment. but it does depend. Libraries can be very hard when you have 3 teams that are separate teams, right? In some cases, so like in the case that I was describing, where we kind of had this blue and purple was one team, the green was one team, the red was one team, separate time zones, separate everything. In that world, oftentimes we would have kind of like a translation of what design was talking about into code. We still had these exact same conversations, but we had them with far less alignment. And that was okay. And you can learn to like, there's friction there. And that's one reason why like it's not ideal, is that there's a lot more friction, right? But I think it's important to recognize what each of these areas is bringing to the table, first of all, because it's not just, oh, our stuff doesn't look like what we designed again, or, oh, design's asking for too much again. It's literally like, what are we building together? No matter how together we are, we're building one thing. And the intention that is coming from one side is for the best outcome, right? And so at a core level, you have to have a degree of trust, and you also have to like be trustworthy. Like you have to show respect so that you can be trusted, right? That's a huge component to this. But like at the end of the day, yeah, the people implementing this front end may not be the most design savvy. We may have to have a bunch of back and forth to like really tighten things up. But like what they're doing is hooking it up to the back end, making this entire thing possible too, right? So like we have to remember that, and we have to remember that they're dealing with things that are sometimes out of their control in terms of how something's been built or whatever. That is reality. That's not someone needing to learn design, like, and so it's really important to like think about it as this like good intentions, trust each other. Everyone's coming to the table with a different strength, right? And it's about recognizing what those strengths are, and helping educate, but also more than anything, respecting reality of the situation, right? And where you're at as a team.
And being curious of the other side.
Yeah, absolutely. Like Louis and I have argued things that we've backed away from multiple times just preparing for this call in the past 48 hours, right? Like, and it's because we trust each other and we love each other and we're having fun, right? And there's an opportunity to have fun, and holding on a little bit loosely to our biases is a huge part of that. I know we're coming up to time. We have where's this? We have slides here. We've got some collaboration best practices. Apar, you want to quickly read through some of these? I know we've talked about a bunch, but here's some of the ones that we had written down.
Yeah. So one of the things that Jake and Louis have kind of constantly reiterated is to keep your audience top of mind. Like when you're working with a designer and when you're working with a developer, thinking about who you're talking to and just what their priorities are, because everyone's bringing something to the table. And sometimes that clash comes from different priorities. So being able to understand that allows you to have a bit more empathy on the other side of things, of like, oh, why is the developer saying no to this design choice? And it might just be an immediate no, but there might be a bit more nuance to it. For instance, when Jake was talking about the multi-select and select considerations, where there are a lot of UX considerations for doing something custom as opposed to using the standard component and styling that. And that's something that a conversation needs to happen there about what those trade-offs are and when that trade-off is worth making versus when keep being sorry, I just saw one of the comments, when you're having that conversation with the designer and what's worth keeping your goals from getting forward. Aligning on language is super important. We've talked about design tokens and variables and spacing, and that's one aspect of that. But then there are other opportunities where you can try to understand like where does language stay the same and when does it change. When is like a designer talking about state versus an engineer talking about state, something completely different. Exploring edge cases. This is something we hear all of the time, where a lot of times one of the biggest challenges with handoff is that they'll see a happy path and they're not seeing just kind of like what happens if the text goes over, the copy goes over the number of lines, or what happens in the error state, what happens if there's a network error. And this is a great place for you to have a conversation with your developer, if you're not aware of all the edge cases, or if you're kind of struggling to come up with edge cases. It's a great chance for you to talk to your developer, like, hey, like I'm thinking about this. What are some of the edge cases that you consider happening? And I can have designs ready for you, so that when you're implementing, a developer doesn't have to come up with like substitutes that doesn't meet your vision. And that's like a really great thing to have, a great resource to have, especially during handoff.
Absolutely.
Jay, next slide.
I was just going to say we should publish these slides because we're at time. Yeah. We'll follow up with a link to this information just so that you have it. I know some folks found a lot of this interesting. I want to make sure that they have access. Before everyone goes, I just want to make sure we did the quick poll. All the future live streams are going to be at figma.com/events. This is going to be recorded up on YouTube. Share with your friends, all of that. If you have suggestions, ideas, community@figma.com. We love you. Thanks for hanging out with us. We want to do more of these. Maybe they should be 2 hours instead of 1. I don't know, just thought. But I know we had to kind of rush here at the end, but we just wanted to make sure that we got through all of this. Thank you all so much. Hope you have a beautiful day, rest of your day, night, whatever's going on. And we'll hang soon. Thank you.